40 on a moonless April night. The largest moving object ever built by human hands brushed against a wall of ice. There was no great explosion, no thunderous crash. Most of the people aboard felt only a faint vibration beneath their feet, a trembling so small that some barely looked up from their books, their card games, or their late-night conversations. A few passengers imagined the ship had dropped a propeller blade. Others thought it had merely passed through rough water. In the kitchens, a small collection of pans shifted. In the smoking room, men continued to speak. In the first-class cabins, electric lamps glowed warmly against carved wood and polished brass. Far below, however, seawater was already entering the ship. Cold Atlantic water slipped through openings along the starboard side, filling spaces that had been warm and dry only moments before. The people sleeping above did not yet know that the ship beneath them had been given only a little more than 2 hours to live. They did not know that the ocean liner carrying them toward New York would never see the sunrise. And they could not know that the name painted across the bow would one day become more famous than the kings, presidents, millionaires, and inventors of its age. Titanic, a ship built to represent human confidence. A ship remembered because confidence met the cold, silent reality of the sea. To understand why Titanic mattered, it helps to return to the world that created her. The early 20th century believed deeply in progress. Cities were growing upward. Electric lights were replacing gas lamps. Telephones carried voices across distances that once required days of travel. Motor cars appeared beside horse-drawn carriages. Airplanes had begun to lift uncertainly into the sky. Great factories produced steel, machines, clothing, and goods on a scale earlier generations could scarcely imagine. Europe ruled vast colonial empires. The United States was rising as an industrial power. Millions of people crossed the Atlantic in search of work, family, security, or a completely new life. The ocean was no longer seen only as a dangerous wilderness. It had become a highway, and the ships that crossed it were becoming floating cities. The North Atlantic route between Europe and North America was one of the most important travel corridors on Earth. Every week, liners carried businessmen, tourists, diplomats, laborers, servants, farmers, children, and migrants between the old world and the new. A crossing still demanded respect. Storms could be violent. Fog could erase the horizon. Ice drifted south from Greenland. But the great steamship companies had turned the passage into a regular service, almost like a railway running across the sea. Among the greatest of those companies was the White Star Line. White Star had built its reputation not simply by chasing speed, but by promising comfort. Its ships were intended to feel steady, spacious, and refined. Across the Atlantic, however, competition was fierce. The Cunard Line had introduced Lusitania and Mauretania, fast and powerful ships capable of crossing the ocean in remarkable time. They were symbols of British engineering and maritime pride. White Star needed an answer. The company's chairman, J. Bruce Ismay, and the leadership of the Belfast shipbuilding firm Harland and Wolff began discussing a new class of vessels. Instead of trying to defeat Cunard only through speed, White Star would build ships of extraordinary size and luxury. They would not be racing machines. They would be palaces. 3 sister ships were planned: Olympic, Titanic, and a third vessel that would later be named Britannic. Together, they would become known as the Olympic class. The first, Olympic, would give the class its name. The second, Titanic, would become the most famous. But before Titanic belonged to history, she belonged to Belfast. At the beginning of the 20th century, Belfast was one of the great industrial cities of the British Empire. Its shipyards lined the River Lagan. The air carried the sound of hammers, steam, iron, and labor. Harland and Wolff employed thousands of workers. Men climbed high frameworks with little protection. Riveters heated metal until it glowed, then threw the hot rivets through the air to be caught and hammered into place. Teams worked in rhythm. One man heated, another carried, another held the rivet steady, others drove it tight. The construction of a giant ocean liner required not only engineers and designers, but a city of skilled hands. Platers shaped steel, joiners fitted wood, electricians ran wires, plumbers installed pipes, painters covered immense surfaces. Metalworkers formed railings, vents, hinges, and thousands of small objects that would never be noticed by passengers. The ship began as lines on paper. Then came the keel. then ribs of steel, then plates, then decks. Slowly, a shape emerged beside the river. Titanic's keel was laid in March 1909. For more than 2 years, she grew beneath enormous gantries. People living nearby watched her rise above the yard. Her hull seemed too large for the streets and houses around it. She was approximately 882 feet and 9 inches long, more than 4 city blocks from bow to stern. She measured more than 92 feet across. From keel to the tops of her funnels, she reached roughly the height of a 17-story building. Her gross registered tonnage exceeded 46,000 tons. Numbers alone, however, could not communicate her scale. A person standing beside Titanic's hull saw a wall of black steel curving upward. Workers looked tiny against it. The anchors themselves weighed many tons. Each propeller blade was taller than a man. The central propeller and 2 wing propellers were driven by an immense system of engines. 2 4-cylinder reciprocating steam engines powered the outer propellers. A low-pressure turbine used exhaust steam to drive the center propeller. Deep inside the hull were boiler rooms containing 29 boilers. Hundreds of furnace doors had to be fed with coal. Firemen and trimmers worked in heat, dust, and darkness so that passengers many decks above could move through bright rooms without thinking about where the power came from. Titanic was a monument to the visible elegance of the age and the invisible labor beneath it. Her hull was divided by 15 transverse bulkheads, creating 16 main watertight compartments. Watertight doors could be closed from the bridge and, in many locations, automatically. The design was considered extremely safe. Titanic could remain afloat with any 2 adjacent compartments flooded. She could also survive flooding in the first 4 compartments. This was impressive by the standards of the period. Yet the system had a limitation. The bulkheads did not rise all the way to the top of the ship. If the bow sank low enough, water could spill over the top of one bulkhead into the next compartment, then the next, moving gradually through the ship. The designers did not expect damage extending across enough compartments to make this happen. Titanic was not created carelessly. She was built according to respected engineering principles, inspected under the rules of her time, and operated by experienced professionals. The tragedy came not from one simple flaw, but from many factors aligning in a way almost no one had imagined. Construction itself was dangerous. Industrial safety standards were far different from those of the modern world. Workers were injured. Several died during the building and fitting out of Titanic. Their names rarely appear in famous stories about the ship, yet their labor remained in every rivet, plate, staircase, pipe, and cabin. On May 31, 1911, Titanic was ready to be launched. The hull had not yet received her engines, funnels, furniture, or luxurious interiors. She was still an empty steel shell. But Belfast gathered to watch. Launch day was not accompanied by a ceremonial bottle of champagne. Harland and Wolff did not traditionally christen its ships in that manner. Instead, the enormous hull was released from the slipway. Tons of soap, grease, and oil helped her move. For a moment, the ship that had seemed part of the land began sliding toward the river lagoon. Chains and anchors slowed her once she entered the water. The launch took little more than a minute. Years of design and labor entered the river in silence compared with the noise of construction. Yet Titanic was still far from complete. For the next 10 months, she was fitted out. The empty spaces inside her became rooms, corridors, dining saloons, cabins, kitchens, mechanical spaces, storage rooms, lounges, and stairways. Her 4 funnels were installed. Only 3 were connected to boiler uptakes. The 4th served ventilation and helped give the ship a balanced, powerful appearance. The funnels were painted in White Star colors, warm buff with black tops. The hull was black above the waterline, red below it, divided by a narrow golden line. Her name appeared in white letters. Her stern carried her port of registry, Liverpool. Although Titanic would sail from Southampton, White Star's official home remained Liverpool. Titanic's interiors were designed to impress different groups in different ways. First class offered a level of comfort intended to compete with the finest hotels in London, Paris, and New York. There were rooms decorated in styles inspired by different historical periods. Oak paneling, carved moldings, silk coverings, electric lights, soft carpets, marble sinks, brass fittings, private sitting rooms. Some suites included their own promenade spaces. The most famous interior feature was the grand staircase. It rose beneath a glass dome, allowing daylight to fall into the center of the ship. A carved clock overlooked the landing, surrounded by figures representing honor and glory crowning time. Passengers could descend toward dining rooms and public spaces as if entering a country house rather than traveling through the North Atlantic. The first-class dining saloon was enormous. There was a reception room where passengers gathered before dinner, a lounge for conversation and reading, a smoking room reserved for gentlemen, a writing and reading room, used especially by women, a gymnasium equipped with mechanical exercise devices, a squash court, a swimming bath, Turkish baths, a restaurant called the à la carte, operated separately from the main dining room. The Café Parisien offered wicker furniture and the atmosphere of a fashionable European café. For the wealthy, Titanic was not simply transportation. It was an environment designed to make the ocean disappear. Second class was less extravagant, but still extremely comfortable. Its accommodations compared favorably with first class on many older ships. Passengers had a library, dining room, smoking room, and pleasant cabins. Second-class travelers included teachers, clergy, merchants, professionals, tourists, and families. They were neither the wealthiest nor the poorest people aboard. Their experience often disappears between stories of millionaires and migrants, but they formed an important world of their own. Third class was designed for people who paid far less, many of whom were immigrating to North America. They slept in simpler cabins, usually shared. Single men and single women were generally housed in different parts of the ship. Families could remain closer together. Third class had its own dining rooms and common spaces. The accommodation was basic compared with first class, yet it was cleaner and more organized than the open dormitories found on many earlier immigrant ships. For some passengers, the bed, electric light, and regular meals aboard Titanic were more comfortable than conditions they had known on land. But class still shaped nearly every part of the journey. Where passengers slept, where they ate, which decks they could enter, how easily they could reach the boat deck in an emergency. The ship was a floating reflection of the society that built it. Elegant at the top, industrial at the bottom, and divided by invisible as well as visible walls. By early April 1912, Titanic was nearly ready. She underwent sea trials near Belfast. Her engines were tested. She turned, stopped, and moved through the water under the observation of officials and company representatives. The trials were brief by modern standards, but the ship was approved. On April 2nd, she left Belfast for Southampton. The city that had built her watched as she moved down Belfast Lough and into the Irish Sea. For the workers of Harland and Wolff, it must have been a moment of pride. Their ship was complete. Ahead lay the maiden voyage. Southampton to Cherbourg. Cherbourg to Queenstown. Then westward across the Atlantic to New York. Titanic was scheduled to arrive in Manhattan after a journey of less than a week. Everything appeared prepared. Cabins had been assigned. Coal loaded. Food stored. Crew signed on. Mail brought aboard. Luggage moved through the docks. Passengers held tickets that seemed to promise not merely a crossing, but participation in the future. No one standing on the Southampton waterfront could see the field of ice drifting far away in the North Atlantic. No one could see the chain of small decisions already waiting to meet the ship. And no one could know that Titanic's story, which appeared ready to begin, was already moving toward its end. Southampton in April 1912 was a city shaped by the sea. Ships arrived and departed with the tides. Railway lines carried passengers directly toward the docks. Hotels filled with travelers. Porters moved trunks, hat boxes, crates, and leather cases. Sailors searched for work. Families gathered beside gangways. Steam whistles echoed across the harbor. Titanic waited at White Star Dock 44. For many of the crew, joining the ship was not a romantic adventure. It was employment. Southampton had been suffering from the effects of a coal strike that disrupted shipping and left many seamen without work. Titanic represented wages. Men came hoping to sign on as deck crew, stewards, firemen, trimmers, cooks, engineers, musicians, postal clerks, and wireless operators. The final crew would include people performing hundreds of different tasks. Some would be seen by passengers every day. Others would spend the entire voyage below decks. Captain Edward John Smith came aboard to command the ship. Smith was one of White Star's most experienced captains. He had spent decades at sea and had commanded Titanic's sister ship. He was familiar to wealthy passengers and respected within the company. Some newspapers later described the maiden voyage as his final crossing before retirement, though the certainty of that claim is debated. What is clear is that he was nearing the end of a long career. To many passengers, his presence would have been reassuring. Thomas Andrews also sailed. He was the managing director and head of the design department at Harland and Wolff. Andrews had helped shape the Olympic-class ships. He was not aboard merely as a ceremonial guest. He traveled with a group of shipyard workers known as the Guarantee Group, who observed the vessel during its early voyages, noted problems, and arranged improvements. Andrews walked through Titanic with a designer's eye. A fitting that needed adjustment. A door that did not close properly. A piece of equipment that could be improved. To most passengers, the ship appeared perfect. To Andrews, it was a living machine still revealing its details. Bruce Ismay, chairman and managing director of the White Star Line, also joined the voyage. He was one of the most powerful men in international shipping. Later, his survival would make him one of the most criticized figures connected to the disaster. But on the morning of departure, he was simply the senior company official traveling on White Star's newest vessel. The first-class passenger list included some of the wealthiest people in the world. John Jacob Astor IV was returning to America with his young wife, Madeline. Astor belonged to one of the richest families in the United States. He was an inventor, businessman, author, and real estate heir. His presence attracted attention. Benjamin Guggenheim came from another great American industrial family. He traveled with his valet and with the singer Leontine Aubert and her maid. Isidore Straus, a co-owner of Macy's department store, sailed with his wife, Ida. They had been married for more than 40 years. Their story would later become one of the most remembered of the night. Margaret Brown, a wealthy American traveler from Colorado, boarded at Cherbourg. She would become famous under the later nickname Molly Brown, though people during her lifetime generally knew her as Margaret. There were also industrialists, artists, military officers, sportsmen, social figures, servants, and families. Yet first class was only one part of Titanic. Second class included passengers such as Lawrence Beasley, an English science teacher traveling toward a new life in North America. His later written account would become one of the important survivor descriptions of the voyage. There were ministers, missionaries, musicians, businessmen, widows, mothers, and children. Third class carried the largest and most internationally diverse group. People came from Britain, Ireland, Scandinavia, Central Europe, the Balkans, the Middle East, and many other regions. Some were traveling alone. Others moved in families or village groups. They carried addresses written on paper, letters from relatives, small savings, clothing packed carefully into trunks, religious objects, food from home, the names of people waiting in America. For them, New York was often not the final destination. They hoped to continue toward farms, mines, factories, towns, and neighborhoods across the United States and Canada. Some were joining husbands who had traveled earlier. Some intended to earn money and return home. Some were leaving poverty, political pressure, limited opportunity, or family hardship. Some were simply curious about what a new country might offer. Their individual stories were different, but they shared the uncertain courage of migration. A ship ticket did not guarantee success. It guaranteed only passage. At the dock, passengers entered through separate gangways according to class. Medical inspections were especially important for third-class travelers because United States immigration authorities could reject people believed to carry disease. White Star did not want to transport a passenger to America only to be required to bring that person back at the company's expense. People were examined, documented, and directed into the ship. The first impression depended greatly on the entrance. Wealthy passengers entered areas of polished wood and attentive service. Third-class travelers moved through more functional spaces. But almost everyone felt the same basic sensation. Titanic seemed immense. Corridors stretched farther than expected. Staircases led to unfamiliar levels. Cabin numbers had to be learned. Stewards guided passengers through the floating maze. On the morning of April 10th, smoke rose from the funnels. Deep below, boilers produced steam. Tugs prepared to assist. Lines were released. At noon, Titanic began moving away from Southampton. Crowds watched from the dock. Some waved handkerchiefs. Some looked for familiar faces. Passengers lined the rails. For a moment, departure seemed entirely ordinary. Then the movement of Titanic's enormous hull created a dangerous disturbance. Nearby lay two smaller liners, New York and Oceanic. As Titanic passed, the pressure and movement of water caused New York's mooring lines to strain and snap. The smaller ships swung toward Titanic. People on the decks watched the distance narrow. A collision at the very beginning of the maiden voyage appeared possible. Tugs reacted quickly. Titanic's engines were adjusted. New York passed within only a short distance of the new liner. The ships did not strike. The danger passed. Some later treated the incident as an omen. But ships often experienced close maneuvers in crowded harbors. At the time, it was more likely seen as an inconvenience and a demonstration of how much water Titanic displaced. Departure had been delayed for about an hour. Then, the ship continued into the English Channel. The coastline slowly receded. For those emigrating, the view carried a deeper meaning. England disappeared behind them. Some would never see Europe again. That evening, Titanic reached Cherbourg, France. The harbor was not deep enough for the great liner to dock directly. Smaller tender vessels carried passengers and luggage between shore and ship. Among those boarding were John Jacob Astor and Madeline Astor, Margaret Brown, Benjamin Guggenheim, and other travelers who had come through Paris or elsewhere in Europe. As night fell, the lights of the French coast faded. Titanic moved west. The next stop was Queenstown, on the southern coast of Ireland, known today as Cove. On the morning of April 11th, the ship anchored offshore. Again, tenders approached. Mailbags came aboard. So did more passengers, many of them Irish immigrants. Small boats moved around the liner. Local merchants sold goods. Visitors and officials briefly entered the ship. One passenger who left at Queenstown was Father Francis Brown, a Jesuit priest and enthusiastic photographer. He had traveled from Southampton and taken a remarkable series of photographs aboard Titanic. He had hoped to continue to New York after an American family offered to pay for his passage. But his religious superior ordered him to leave the ship as planned. Brown obeyed. Because he stepped ashore in Ireland, his photographs survived. They provide some of the last clear images of Titanic's decks, rooms, officers, crew, and passengers during the voyage. From Queenstown, the tenders returned to shore. Passengers remaining aboard looked toward Ireland. The land became smaller. The final pilot left. At approximately early afternoon, Titanic turned toward the open Atlantic. There would be no more stops before New York. The last known photograph of the ship afloat was taken as she moved away from Ireland. Her black hull appeared long and low on the water. For funnels rose above the decks. A small boat occupied the foreground. The image contains no visible warning. Only a ship beginning an ocean crossing beneath a pale sky. Once at sea, the voyage settled into routine. Titanic's passengers lived in separate worlds. In first class, breakfast could be taken in the dining saloon, in private cabins, or in the restaurant. Menus offered eggs, fish, meats, breads, fruit, tea, and coffee. The amount of food stored aboard was enormous. Thousands of pounds of meat, tens of thousands of eggs, vegetables, fruit, flour, sugar, tea, coffee, milk, butter, cheese, and bottled drinks. The ship carried everything needed to support a temporary town at sea. Stewards cleaned cabins, delivered messages, served meals, answered questions, and helped passengers navigate. Laundry had been prepared before departure. Linens were changed. Silverware polished. Tables set. In the kitchens, cooks worked around heat and steam. Dishwashers faced endless stacks. Bakers prepared bread. Butchers handled meat. Scullery workers cleaned equipment. A luxurious dinner required a large hidden system of labor. First-class passengers walked the promenade decks wrapped in coats. They sat in deck chairs, read books, wrote letters, or spoke with fellow travelers. Some visited the gymnasium, where an instructor demonstrated electric exercise machines. One device imitated the movement of a camel. Another offered the sensation of rowing. There were stationary bicycles and mechanical equipment that seemed modern and amusing. The swimming bath was filled with seawater and available at different times for men and women. The Turkish baths offered warm rooms, cooling rooms, decorative tiles, and attendance. The squash court required a fee and reservation. Life aboard could be highly structured. Breakfast, walking, reading, lunch, more walking, tea, dressing for dinner, dinner itself, conversation in the lounge or smoking room, then sleep while the engines carried the ship hundreds of miles through darkness. In second class, the atmosphere was quieter and less ceremonial. Passengers read in the library, played games, talked, and walked along their own promenade areas. The meals were good. Cabins were warm. People made acquaintances. A transatlantic crossing created temporary communities. Strangers who might never meet on land shared tables for days. They discussed professions, destinations, relatives, politics, weather, and the ship itself. In third class, passengers also found ways to make the voyage social. People gathered in common rooms. They played cards. Children explored. Music and dancing sometimes filled the open spaces. Different languages could be heard in nearby groups. A Norwegian family might sit close to Irish travelers. A Syrian passenger might speak Arabic near someone from Croatia or Sweden. The White Star Line employed interpreters to help some immigrants communicate. Meals were served at long tables. The food was simpler than in first class, but substantial. Third-class passengers did not spend the voyage as a single undivided group. The ship's layout separated men, women, and families in complicated ways. Travel companions could be housed far apart. Some passengers knew the path to the open decks. Others did not. This difference would matter later. For now, the sea remained calm. Titanic increased speed gradually as new machinery settled into service. She was not trying to win the blue ribbon for the fastest Atlantic crossing. Mauritania was much faster. But White Star expected a strong, punctual performance. Titanic moved at more than 20 knots, a steady pace for a ship of her size. The wake stretched behind her. Smoke trailed over the sea. Below decks, the engine room telegraphs rang instructions. Engineers monitored gauges, pumps, bearings, and steam pressure. Firemen shoveled coal into furnaces. Trimmers moved coal inside bunkers to keep the ship balanced and ensure the fires remained supplied. Coal dust covered skin and clothing. The temperature near the furnaces could become exhausting. Men worked in watches, then climbed away from the heat to eat and rest. A coal fire had been burning in one of Titanic's bunkers before departure. Such fires were not unknown on steamships. Crew members worked to control and remove the affected coal. Later theories would claim that this fire played a decisive role in the sinking. Most historians do not consider it the primary cause of the disaster. The iceberg collision opened the ship to the sea across too many compartments. Still, the fire reminds us that even before the famous collision, Titanic was not a silent, effortless palace. She was an industrial machine operating under constant human attention. At the stern, two young wireless operators worked in a small room. Jack Phillips, the senior operator, was 25. Harold Bride, the junior operator, was 22. They were employed by the Marconi Company rather than directly by White Star. Their equipment could send messages through Morse code across hundreds of miles. Passengers paid to send greetings, business instructions, and personal notes to stations on land or to other ships. Wireless communication was still relatively new. To many travelers, it seemed almost magical. A message tapped out in the middle of the Atlantic could reach New York before the ship. Phillips and Bride handled commercial traffic, but they also received navigational information, including reports of ice. The wireless set had failed temporarily during the voyage. The operators worked for hours to repair it, even though standard procedure might have required waiting for a technician. Once the equipment returned to service, a backlog of passenger messages had accumulated. Phillips spent long hours transmitting them through the station at Cape Race, Newfoundland. The wireless room became one of the busiest places on the ship. It would later become one of the most important. Each day, Titanic received information from nearby vessels. Some reports described ice. This was not completely unexpected. The North Atlantic shipping lanes crossed areas where icebergs could appear in spring. Ships warned one another. Captains altered course or maintained lookout. The presence of ice did not automatically stop a liner. The normal practice of the time often involved continuing at speed in clear weather, with the expectation that visible ice could be avoided. It was a belief shaped by experience. It was also a belief about to be tested. By Saturday, April 13th, the voyage appeared successful. Passengers were becoming familiar with the ship. The coast of Europe lay far behind. New York was still days ahead. Titanic seemed stable, quiet, and secure. The sea carried her west beneath changing skies. There were ordinary complaints. A cabin too warm. A draft in a corridor. A delay in service. Minor defects noted by Thomas Andrews. But no sign of approaching disaster. On Sunday morning, April 14th, passengers prepared for another peaceful day. Church services would be held. Meals would be served. Messages would be sent. The ship would continue toward America. Somewhere ahead, icebergs drifted south into the shipping lanes. They had broken from Greenland glaciers months, or perhaps years before. Wind and current carried them gradually into warmer water. Most of each iceberg remained hidden below the surface. Above the water stood only the visible crown. One of them waited in Titanic's path. The ship was still hundreds of miles away, and the day began with sunlight. Sunday, April 14th, 1912, arrived quietly. Titanic was now deep in the North Atlantic. The ship's clocks had been adjusted during the voyage to account for the westward movement through time zones. Each day became slightly longer as the clocks were turned back. Passengers woke to a calm sea. The weather was clear. The ship moved with remarkably little motion. For those who feared seasickness, it was an ideal crossing. For the officers responsible for seeing danger ahead, that calmness would later become a problem. A gentle swell breaks against the base of an iceberg and creates white water. On a perfectly smooth sea, there may be no such warning. The iceberg can appear as a dark shape against darkness, almost without movement. Morning services were held aboard. Captain Smith conducted a service for first-class passengers in the dining saloon. Another service was held for second class. Passengers dressed formally. Prayers were spoken. Hymns were sung. Few people imagined that this would be their last Sunday. Throughout the day, wireless messages concerning ice reached Titanic. The details and handling of those messages have been examined for more than a century. Some warnings reached the bridge. Some were posted. Some were discussed among officers. Others were received by the wireless operators while they were busy with passenger traffic and did not reach the bridge in time. It is tempting to imagine one clear warning marked with destiny, ignored by everyone who should have understood it. Reality was less simple. Ships in the region were sending reports from different positions at different times. The reports described icebergs, growlers, and field ice spread across a broad area. Titanic's officers knew there was ice ahead. The question was not whether ice existed. The question was how close it was, how extensive it was, and how the ship should respond. At about 9 in the morning, the liner Coronia sent a warning describing ice in the region ahead. Captain Smith received it. Later, the Baltic transmitted another message, reporting icebergs and field ice. Smith showed this message to J. Bruce Ismay. The paper was seen in Ismay's hand during the afternoon before eventually returning to the bridge. The exchange later became part of the debate over Ismay's influence aboard the ship. Did the company chairman pressure the captain to maintain speed? Did they hope to reach New York early? Evidence has never supported the simplest dramatic versions of this story. Titanic was expected to perform well, and speed was part of normal liner operations. But there is no reliable proof of a secret order to race for a record the ship could not realistically win. The more troubling truth is also more ordinary. Experienced men followed the accepted practices of their profession. They believed clear weather, trained lookouts, and a maneuverable ship would give them time to avoid danger. The procedures had worked before. That Sunday, the assumptions behind them failed. Around lunchtime, passengers ate in separate dining rooms. In first class, the final luncheon menu included a wide selection of dishes. Some people lingered over conversation. Others went outside. The air grew colder during the afternoon. Passengers who had walked comfortably earlier returned for heavier coats. The sea remained smooth. Titanic's engines continued at a steady speed. 24 of the 29 boilers were in use. The ship was making around 22 knots, though estimates vary slightly. This was below her maximum possible speed, but fast for an area where ice had been reported. Yet in 1912, maintaining speed until ice was actually sighted was not regarded by many captains as reckless. The official inquiries would later examine this practice closely. One of the most haunting lessons of Titanic is that disaster can grow from behavior considered normal until the moment it proves unsafe. During the afternoon, the German liner America sent a wireless report about ice. Because its transmitter could not directly reach the appropriate land station, the message was relayed through Titanic. Later, the Mesaba sent a particularly important warning. It described a large area of heavy pack ice and many icebergs almost directly along Titanic's route. Jack Phillips acknowledged the message, but he was working through a heavy load of passenger telegrams. The Mesaba message does not appear to have reached the bridge before the collision. Wireless operators were expected to pass navigational warnings, but the system lacked the standardized priority procedures that would become normal later. The wireless room was both a safety station and a commercial office. The same man might receive an ice warning one moment and transmit a wealthy passenger's private message the next. That mixture reflected a technology still finding its place at sea. As evening approached, the temperature dropped more sharply. Second Officer Charles Lightoller later remembered the cold. Water temperature readings also fell. The bridge officers understood that the ship was entering a dangerous region. Lightoller told the lookouts to watch carefully for ice. The night was exceptionally clear. Stars filled the sky. There was no moon. The horizon appeared sharp in some directions and uncertain in others. Ahead, the darkness of sea and sky blended together. The lookouts climbed to the crow's nest high on the forward mast. That evening, Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee took their watch. They had no binoculars. The missing binoculars later became one of the best-known details of the disaster. A key to the locker had been carried away inadvertently when an officer was reassigned before the voyage. But whether binoculars would have prevented the collision is uncertain. Some experienced sailors argued that lookouts should rely primarily on the naked eye at night, because binoculars narrow the field of view. The absent glasses became a symbol of negligence, but the true problem was larger. The iceberg offered almost no visible warning until Titanic was very close. Dinner on Sunday evening unfolded in warmth and light. First-class passengers entered the dining saloon in formal clothes. Some ate in the a la carte restaurant. The meal there continued late. Conversations moved from table to table. No one could feel the cold seawater outside the hull. Second-class passengers finished their own dinner. Third class ate earlier. Children were put to bed. Stewards prepared cabins. Some passengers wrote letters to be mailed in New York. Others read. Some played cards. Men gathered in the first-class smoking room. The air held the scent of cigars, leather, and polished wood. In the lounge, a fire burned in the grate, though it was likely electric rather than an open coal fire. Music had been heard during the evening. Titanic carried 8 musicians employed through an agency. The band was divided into smaller groups for different parts of the day. Wallace Hartley served as bandmaster. The musicians were passengers in legal terms, but worked as part of the ship's service. Their names were not yet famous. They were simply professionals performing familiar music for travelers. Captain Smith attended a private dinner hosted by the Wideners, a wealthy Philadelphia family. He left before the evening became too late and returned to the bridge. 0 p.m., Smith spoke with Second Officer Lightoller. They discussed the clear weather and the need for caution. Smith instructed Lightoller to wake him if conditions became doubtful. The captain then went to his cabin, close to the bridge. Lightoller remained on watch until 10 p.m. At that hour, First Officer William Murdoch took command of the bridge watch. Murdoch was an experienced officer. He had served aboard Olympic and other ships. With him were Sixth Officer James Moody, Quartermaster Robert Hickens at the wheel, and other crew members performing their duties. The lookouts remained above in the crow's nest. The ship moved westward. Its lights shone across the decks, but did not illuminate the ocean far ahead. The bow cut through water so calm that little spray rose from it. 30 p.m., the small cargo passenger ship Californian stopped for the night because it had entered an area of ice. Its wireless operator, Cyril Evans, attempted to warn Titanic. Californian was relatively close, though the exact distance remains debated. Evans sent a message telling Titanic that his ship was stopped and surrounded by ice. The signal arrived loudly in Jack Phillips's headphones because Titanic's operator was communicating with Cape Race and Californian was nearby. Phillips responded impatiently, telling Evans to keep out because he was working Cape Race. The words have often been presented as careless arrogance. In wireless language of the time, the phrasing was blunt but not extraordinary. Phillips was under pressure and the Californian message had not been prefaced with the formal code that would mark it as a message for the captain. Evans listened for a while longer. 30. He shut down his equipment and went to sleep. Californian had only one wireless operator. 10 minutes later, Titanic would strike the iceberg. On Titanic's bridge, the officers saw no reason yet to reduce speed. The sea remained flat. The stars remained bright. The temperature was near freezing. Lookout Frederick Fleet stared into the darkness. He and Reginald Lee were exposed to the cold wind high above the deck. They watched for anything that interrupted the horizon. 40 p.m., Fleet saw a shape. It appeared directly ahead. At first it may have seemed like a small darkness. Then it grew. Fleet struck the crow's nest bell 3 times. The signal meant an object ahead. He picked up the telephone to the bridge. 6th Officer Moody answered. Fleet reported an iceberg right ahead. Moody thanked him and relayed the warning. 1st Officer Murdoch reacted immediately. The exact sequence of orders has been debated because the surviving witnesses heard or remembered different details. Murdoch ordered the helm turned in an effort to swing the bow away. In the steering language then used on British ships, a command such as hard to starboard directed the tiller to starboard, which turned the ship's bow to port. He also ordered changes to the engines, likely stopping them and perhaps ordering full astern. The watertight doors to the boiler and engine spaces were closed. Quartermaster Hickens spun the wheel. The ship began to turn, but Titanic was almost 900 feet long. At more than 20 knots, she covered hundreds of feet in seconds. A ship that large could not move sideways. The bow slowly answered the helm. From the crow's nest, Fleet watched the iceberg grow until it filled his view. Titanic's bow appeared to clear the ice. For a moment, it may have seemed that the maneuver had succeeded. Then the iceberg passed along the starboard side. Those on deck heard a scraping, grinding sound. Chunks of ice fell onto the forward well deck. The contact lasted only seconds. It was not a direct collision that crushed the bow inward. Instead, underwater ice pressed against the hull along several points. Steel plates bent. Riveted seams opened. The damage was spread across the first 5 compartments and perhaps into a 6th. The total openings were not one enormous continuous gash, as people once imagined. Modern analysis suggests a series of narrow separations and fractures. Together, their area may have been surprisingly small, but they were distributed across too much of the hull. Water entered the forepeak, then cargo holds, then boiler room number 6. The design could survive 4 forward compartments flooding. 5 were enough to pull the bow so low that water would eventually spill over the bulkheads. The ship had received a fatal wound. Most passengers did not understand that anything serious had happened. Some woke when the engine stopped. The steady vibration that had accompanied the voyage disappeared. Silence itself became noticeable. In first class, a few people stepped into corridors and asked stewards what had happened. Some felt a shiver beneath the floor. Others noticed glasses or objects moving. A passenger later compared the sound to tearing a long strip of cloth. In third-class areas near the bow, the collision was more obvious. People heard grinding. They saw ice through portholes or found water entering low spaces. Crew members in the forward sections faced the danger first. In boiler room number 6, water came through the ship's side. Firemen and engineers struggled to escape and close systems. The watertight door descended. Some men climbed through before it shut. The compartment began to fill. The mail room lay on a low deck forward. Titanic carried thousands of sacks of mail, making her a Royal Mail ship. 5 postal clerks worked aboard, 2 British and 3 American. After the collision, they found water entering the mail hold. They tried to move sacks upward. The water rose too quickly. Their effort was almost certainly hopeless, but they continued. None of the 5 postal clerks survived. On the bridge, Murdoch ordered the watertight doors closed. The ship's carpenter and other crew members were sent to inspect for damage. Captain Smith arrived. He asked what had happened. The engines were stopped. The iceberg disappeared behind the ship into darkness. It had come and gone in less than a minute. Titanic now floated quietly on the Atlantic. There was no storm, no towering wave, no second impact. Only a cold night, a clear sky, and an almost motionless sea. Thomas Andrews began inspecting the damaged areas with Captain Smith and ship officers. They moved through corridors and descended toward the bow. Water had entered the forward compartments. The squash court, deep within the ship, was flooding. The mail room was filling. In the lower decks, crew members felt the deck beginning to slope. Andrews understood the design better than anyone aboard. He knew the heights of the bulkheads. He knew how much flooding the ship could survive. He knew that once the bow settled far enough, water would spill from one compartment to the next. The process could not be stopped by pumps. The pumps might slow it. They could not reverse it. According to later accounts, Andrews gave the ship perhaps an hour to an hour and a half. Titanic would remain afloat somewhat longer. But the conclusion was correct. The ship would sink. Captain Smith now faced a reality that seemed impossible only minutes earlier. More than 2,000 people were aboard. The ship carried lifeboat capacity for only about half of them, and the ocean outside was cold enough to kill quickly. At approximately midnight, orders began moving through the ship. Uncover the lifeboats. Prepare passengers. Bring them to the boat deck. Send a distress call. The voyage had changed in 20 minutes. The floating palace had become a sinking ship, and most of the people inside still did not believe they were in danger. The first orders did not sound like the beginning of a catastrophe. Stewards moved through the corridors telling passengers to put on warm clothing and life belts. Some knocked softly. Others opened doors and called into cabins. The message varied from place to place. There had been a small accident. Passengers should dress. They should come to the boat deck as a precaution. There was no need for alarm. This calm language was understandable. Panic inside a ship could be dangerous, but it also reinforced the belief that nothing serious was happening. Titanic felt too solid to sink. The lights remained bright. The carpets were dry in most passenger areas. The air was warm. Stewards stood in uniform. The great staircase still looked exactly as it had at dinner. Outside, the sea appeared quiet. Passengers who reached the boat deck found sailors removing covers from lifeboats and swinging the boats outward. Many had never taken part in a proper lifeboat drill. A drill had been planned for that Sunday, but was not held. The crew had conducted limited exercises in Southampton, and some sailors understood their assigned stations. Others did not. Titanic carried 20 lifeboats. 14 were standard wooden boats. 2 were smaller emergency cutters. 4 were collapsible boats with canvas sides. Together, they could carry approximately 1,178 people. More than 2,200 passengers and crew were aboard. Even if every seat had been filled, more than 1,000 people would remain without a place. The shortage did not violate the British regulations then in force. Those rules linked lifeboat requirements largely to a ship's tonnage and had not kept pace with the growth of ocean liners. Titanic actually carried more boat capacity than the minimum legally required. The law had treated lifeboats partly as a way to transfer people to another ship, not necessarily as a means of keeping everyone afloat after the vessel itself disappeared. The ship's designers had considered additional boats. The davits installed on Titanic could support more than the 20 carried, but extra boats were not required, and a larger number might have crowded the promenade areas. No single person stood on the deck before departure and openly chose that hundreds should die. Instead, regulation, custom, confidence, design preference, and cost had gradually produced a ship with too few boats. Disaster often begins that way, not with one villain, with many ordinary decisions that seem harmless until they meet an extraordinary night. Below the boat deck, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride began sending distress messages. Captain Smith brought Titanic's position and told them to call for assistance. Phillips first transmitted CQD, the established Marconi distress signal. Bride later suggested he also try SOS, a newer international signal. It was not the first use of SOS in history, as later legends sometimes claimed. But the combination of CQD and SOS from Titanic would make the newer signal famous. The messages traveled invisibly across the night. Ships within hundreds of miles heard them. Titanic had struck an iceberg. Titanic required immediate assistance. Titanic was sinking by the head. The closest ship known to receive and respond was Carpathia, a Cunard liner traveling eastward from New York toward Europe. Its wireless operator, Harold Cottam, had been preparing for sleep. He happened to check for messages and learned from another station that traffic was waiting for Titanic. When he contacted Titanic, Phillips told him the ship was in distress. Cottam carried the message to Captain Arthur Rostron. Rostron did not waste time debating whether the call was serious. He immediately turned Carpathia toward Titanic's position. The ship was approximately 58 nautical miles away. At normal speed, the distance was substantial. Rostron ordered every available effort made to reach the scene. Extra firemen were called. Heating and hot water were reduced so that more steam could be directed to the engines. Lookouts were posted for ice. Lifeboats were prepared. Blankets, food, medical supplies, and warm drinks were organized. Gangway doors were readied. Carpathia drove through the dark at a speed greater than she was normally expected to achieve. But even at that pace, she could not arrive before Titanic sank. Other ships received the call. Olympic, Titanic's sister, was hundreds of miles away. Frankfurt answered. Baltic answered. Virginian and Mount Temple received messages. Each was too far away or obstructed by ice. The mystery centered on Californian. From Titanic's decks, officers and passengers saw lights of a vessel in the distance. They believed a ship might be only a few miles away. Rockets were fired. Morse lamps flashed. But the distant vessel did not come. Californian's officers also saw a large ship's lights and later observed rockets. Its wireless operator had gone to bed. The captain was told about the rockets, but their meaning was not understood or acted upon with sufficient urgency. The exact positions of both ships and the identity of every light seen remained subjects of debate. The official inquiries concluded that Californian was near enough to have assisted and might have saved many lives. Whatever the precise distance, the image remains haunting. One ship dying in the dark, another stopped among ice. Lights visible across the water. No rescue moving between them. On Titanic, the first challenge was persuading passengers to enter the boats. The deck appeared safer than a small wooden craft hanging high above a black ocean. The ship had heat, light, music, and familiar rooms. The lifeboats looked exposed and fragile. Many husbands and wives did not want to separate. Some passengers had received only vague instructions. Others had not yet reached the boat deck. The officers understood that women and children should board first, but they interpreted the order differently. On the port side, Second Officer Lightoller treated it largely as women and children only. Men were usually prevented from entering even when seats remained. On the starboard side, First Officer Murdoch allowed men to board when no women or children were immediately waiting. This difference affected survival. 40 a.m., the first lifeboat, number 7, was lowered from the starboard side. It had room for 65 people. It left with roughly 28. The precise numbers in individual boats vary among sources, but the larger fact is certain. Several early boats were launched far below capacity. Boat number 5 followed with about 40 people. Third Officer Herbert Pittman was placed in command. When the boat reached the water, its occupants could look upward at Titanic's long, illuminated side. The scale of the ship made the danger difficult to understand. From a small boat, the liner still appeared enormous and stable. On the port side, boat number 6 prepared to leave. Margaret Brown entered. Quartermaster Robert Hickens was placed in charge. Lookout Frederick Fleet also boarded. The boat carried fewer than 30 people, though it could hold more than 60. As it descended, officers called for an experienced sailor. Major Arthur Puchin, a first-class passenger and yachtsman, was allowed to climb down a rope into the boat. He became one of the few adult men permitted into an early portside boat. Boat number 8 left with women from first class. No men were accepted as passengers. Among those near it were Isidore and Ida Strauss. Ida was offered a place. She initially stepped toward the boat, then turned back. She would not leave her husband. According to remembered accounts, she said they had lived together for many years and would go where they went together. Isidore refused to enter ahead of younger men. A maid was given Ida's fur coat. The couple remained aboard. Their final exact movements are unknown. Their choice became one of the enduring human stories of the disaster. Not because they knew how history would remember them, but because, at the edge of separation, they chose companionship. Around the ship, families faced decisions with almost no time and incomplete information. Some husbands placed wives and children into boats, promising to follow later. Some women refused until ordered. Some passengers believed the boats would remain near Titanic and return. Others thought they were being transferred temporarily to another vessel. Many expected the ship to stay afloat until help arrived. That expectation was not entirely irrational. The lights of a possible ship were visible. Wireless messages had been sent. Titanic's size created a sense of security even as the bow settled lower. Thomas Andrews moved through rooms and corridors urging people to wear life belts and go outside. He knew more clearly than almost anyone that time was disappearing. Survivors later remembered him searching cabins, opening doors, and encouraging passengers to enter the boats. He reportedly criticized the loading of boats with empty seats. His exact path cannot be reconstructed in every detail, but multiple accounts describe a man working quietly against a disaster he understood and could not prevent. Captain Smith moved between the bridge, wireless room, and boat deck. He gave orders. He supervised rockets. He asked the wireless operators what ships had answered. Later portrayals sometimes show him frozen and helpless from the beginning. Survivor evidence presents a more complicated picture. He acted. He directed. But the scale of the emergency exceeded every plan aboard. Smith had minutes to organize the evacuation of a ship carrying thousands of people at night, with too few boats and no nearby rescue. No captain could make those facts disappear. The deck beneath everyone's feet continued to tilt. At first the angle was slight. A passenger might notice that walking forward felt easier than walking aft. Water crept upward through the bow. The forward well deck moved closer to the sea. Pumps operated below. Engineers remained at their stations. Electricians and engineers worked to keep power flowing. Joseph Bell, Titanic's chief engineer, and the men under him maintained steam, electricity, and pumping systems for as long as possible. Because the lights stayed on, passengers could see. Because the wireless had power, distress calls continued. Because the ship remained illuminated, boats could be lowered with greater order. The engineering crew's work bought time for people above. Most of those men did not survive. The musicians began playing. At first, music may have been intended simply to calm passengers while they gathered. The band likely performed light, familiar pieces. Ragtime, popular tunes, waltzes. The exact sequence is unknown. No complete list survives. Yet many witnesses agreed that musicians played during the evacuation. On a cold deck, beneath electric lamps, while rockets rose into the sky, their music created a strange connection to ordinary life. The notes could not save the ship. They could make fear less lonely. Deep in the vessel, third-class passengers faced a more difficult path to the boats. The idea that crew members deliberately locked all third-class travelers below to die is an oversimplification. Gates and barriers existed for immigration regulations and class separation. Some were low and could be opened. Others were more substantial. Stewards attempted to wake passengers and direct groups upward, but the layout was confusing. Instructions were often given only in English. Families were housed in different sections. Routes used during daily life did not lead directly to the boat deck. Some stairways ended at barriers or unfamiliar corridors. Crew members responsible for third class were fewer in relation to the number of passengers. There were also delays in allowing groups into first and second class areas. All of this created a deadly disadvantage. A first-class passenger might climb a familiar staircase and reach the boats quickly. A third-class passenger could travel through long passageways, climb several decks, meet a closed door, turn back, and try another route. By the time many arrived, several boats had already gone. Yet third-class passengers were not passive. Some found their own way. Groups moved upward. Men broke or climbed barriers. Families followed crew members. Passengers helped one another. The stories differ because hundreds of individual journeys unfolded simultaneously in a ship more than 800 feet long. A Syrian passenger might be moving aft while an Irish family climbed forward. A Swedish mother might search for a child. A crewman might lead one group and lose another at a turning. There was no single third-class experience. Only time passing unevenly through different parts of the ship. 45 a.m. Titanic fired the first distress rocket. A flash lit the deck. Then a white starburst opened in the sky. The sound rolled across the water. More rockets followed at intervals. Passengers in the boats watched them rise above the four funnels. People aboard Californian saw rockets near the distant ship. Still, no vessel approached. The wireless room continued tapping. Carpathia was coming, but it remained far away. As the hour moved past 1 in the morning, the seriousness became clearer. The bow had sunk noticeably. The ship's forward deck was approaching the water. Lifeboats began leaving with more passengers. Boat number 3 departed from starboard. Boat number 1, one of the small emergency cutters, left with only about 12 people despite a capacity of 40. Among them were Sir Cosmo Duff Gordon, Lady Duff Gordon, and her secretary, Laura Francatelli. After the sinking, money was given to crewmen in the boat. This created accusations that the Duff Gordons had bribed sailors not to return for survivors. The British inquiry found no proof of such an agreement before the sinking. The payment appears to have been promised after concerns were raised that crewmen had lost their possessions and wages. But the image of a nearly empty boat carrying wealthy passengers became deeply controversial. Perception mattered. A disaster shaped by class inequality made every empty seat look like a moral judgment. Boat number 10 and other portside boats were prepared. Women and children entered. Some babies were passed across gaps. Some passengers jumped a short distance into boats as they were lowered. Officers struggled with ropes and davits. The boats had to be lowered approximately 70 feet to the water. If the ropes moved unevenly, a boat could tilt dangerously. Passengers were told to sit still. Sailors worked the falls by hand. The calm sea helped. In rough weather, the evacuation would have been far more chaotic. Even so, boats risked being caught by water discharged from the ship or drawn toward the side. Once afloat, crews rowed away. Many remained nearby. Few returned immediately for more passengers. People feared that a crowded boat would be swamped by desperate swimmers when Titanic sank. This fear later caused anger and guilt. But in the darkness before the ship disappeared, no one knew exactly what would happen. The boats were scattered. Some lacked enough trained sailors. Some carried frightened children and lightly dressed passengers. The people inside made choices while looking at a ship still glowing like a city. 15 a.m. Titanic developed a visible list and the bow sank deeper. The downward angle increased. Water reached places that had seemed safe minutes earlier. On the boat deck, the supply of lifeboats was disappearing. More passengers finally understood that the ship itself would not survive. The mood changed. The early reluctance to leave gave way to urgency. People pressed closer. Officers warned them back. The night remained calm. The stars remained bright. And every few minutes, another small boat descended into the black water, carrying some toward life and leaving many behind. After 1 o'clock, the separation between belief and reality disappeared. Passengers could see that the forward end of Titanic was lower than it had been. The dark line of the ocean climbed along the hull. The tilt of the deck became more difficult to ignore. Objects began to slide in some rooms. Doors no longer hung squarely in their frames. The lower passages grew cold as seawater advanced. People who had returned to cabins for jewelry, money, or warmer clothing now came back to the boat deck with greater urgency. The electric lamps still shone. That steady light made the scene both safer and more unreal. The ship looked alive. Its machinery still breathed through vents. Steam escaped into the night. The funnel stood upright against the stars. But the sea was taking the ship from below. Boat number 12 left from the port side with around 40 people. Boat number 14 was placed under the command of 5th Officer Harold Lowe. Lowe had worked his way upward through sailing ships and steamships before joining Titanic. As passengers crowded around the boat, he fired warning shots along the side of the ship to control the rush. There is no good evidence that he shot anyone. The shots were intended to restore space around the davits. Boat 14 descended with more than 40 people. Later, Lowe would transfer passengers between boats, gather several boats together, and return toward the wreck area. He was one of the few officers who organized a return after Titanic disappeared. Boat number 9 left from starboard. Then number 11, carrying perhaps around 70 people, one of the most heavily loaded boats. A woman passed her baby to someone inside before boarding. Stewards and sailors continued guiding people. The process was no longer neat, but neither was it a complete, uncontrolled panic. Order and fear existed at the same time. Some people waited quietly. Some pleaded. Some refused to separate. Some pushed forward. Some stepped back so another person could enter. History tends to remember the dramatic gesture, but much of the night consisted of small decisions made by people whose names were never recorded. A hand offered. A place surrendered. A child lifted. A direction given. A door held open. A stranger told not to be afraid. John Jacob Astor brought Madeline toward a lifeboat. She was pregnant. As boat number 4 prepared to leave on the port side, Astor asked whether he could accompany her because of her condition. Second Officer Lightoller refused. Astor did not force the issue. He helped her enter. He reportedly asked for the boat's number so he could identify it later. Then he remained aboard. Madeline Astor survived. John Jacob Astor did not. His body would later be recovered from the sea. The difference between wealth and survival was not simple. First-class women had a very high chance of living because they reached the boats early and were given priority. First-class men had a much lower chance. Some wealthy men survived. Many did not. Money could purchase a large suite and attentive service. It could not create an extra lifeboat after the voyage had begun. Benjamin Guggenheim had initially worn a life belt and warm clothing. Later accounts described him changing into evening dress with his valet, Victor Giglio, saying that they were prepared to go down like gentlemen. The exact wording comes through survivor testimony and may have been polished in memory. But Guggenheim remained aboard. His companion Leontine Aubart and her mate escaped in a lifeboat. Guggenheim and Giglio died. Other men made different choices. Some entered boats when officers allowed them. Some found places near the end. Some jumped into the water and reached collapsibles. Survival was shaped by location, timing, physical ability, chance, officer interpretation, and personal decision. No single rule explains every life saved or lost. Bruce Ismay moved near the starboard boats. He helped women and children enter several of them. Near the end, he boarded collapsible C as it was being lowered. He later said no women or children were visible nearby when he stepped in. Others viewed his survival differently. He was the chairman of the company. The captain, designer, engineers, and many passengers would die. Ismay lived. Public anger needed a human target, and he became one. He was criticized as a coward in newspapers and political cartoons. His reputation never recovered. A calmer judgment can recognize two things at once. He had no command authority over the evacuation comparable to the captain or officers. And as the most senior White Star official aboard, his decision to enter a boat while people remained on the ship would always carry moral weight. 40 a.m. Boat number 13 left from starboard, heavily loaded. As it reached the water, it drifted beneath boat number 15, which was being lowered directly above. The crew in number 13 struggled to release the ropes. For a moment, the upper boat threatened to crush the lower one. Men cut the falls, and boat 13 moved away just in time. Boat 15 reached the water safely. The incident showed how rapidly the evacuation was accelerating. The boats were leaving close together. The bow was falling. The margin for error was shrinking. Boat number 2, a small emergency cutter, left from the port side under 4th Officer Joseph Boxhall. Earlier, men had been ordered away from it. It departed with roughly 18 people. Boat number 4 finally left with Madeline Astor and other women. It carried around 30 to 40 people. The exact counts vary because witnesses moved between boats later and records were assembled from imperfect memories. These uncertainties matter. Titanic has often been described through precise minute-by-minute timelines. But people under stress did not all carry synchronized watches. Clocks aboard were being adjusted during the voyage. Witnesses estimated. Some events occurred nearly together. The broad sequence is clear. The exact minute of every launch is not. By now, water was entering the forward part of a deck. The bow rail approached the sea. People moved aft and upward. Those still below faced steepening floors and confusing routes. Some third-class families finally reached the boat deck only to find most boats gone. Others arrived in time. The survival rate among third-class passengers was much lower than among first-class passengers. Men in third class suffered especially. Women and children in third class also died in far greater proportions than their first-class counterparts. The reason was not a single locked gate. It was the combined effect of distance, delay, language, layout, class control, and limited guidance. The inequality of the ship became an inequality of time. And in an evacuation, time was life. Titanic's wireless signals became weaker as the ship lost power and the bow settled. Jack Phillips continued transmitting. Harold Bride moved around the room, assisting. Messages became increasingly direct. The engine room was flooded. The ship could not last much longer. Come quickly. Carpathia replied that she was coming as fast as possible. Phillips and Bride knew it would not be fast enough. Yet they remained at the set. The wireless operators were not regular ship's officers, and Captain Smith eventually released them from duty. Bride later remembered the captain telling them they had done their full duty and could now look after themselves. Phillips continued working for a time. The taps of Morse code moved out across the Atlantic while water climbed through the ship beneath him. On the bridge, Boxhall and others attempted to signal the distant ship with a Morse lamp. Rockets continued to rise. The unknown lights did not move closer. 50 a.m., collapsible C was prepared on the starboard side. Unlike the wooden boats, the collapsibles had rigid wooden bottoms and canvas sides that could be raised. They were stored in places where deck space was limited. C and D stood near the boat deck and could be launched from davits. A and B were stored on the roof of the officers' quarters and would become extremely difficult to launch as the ship sank. Collapsible C left with J. Bruce Ismay among its occupants. Collapsible D became the last boat successfully lowered from the davits. Officers formed a line to control access. Women and children entered. A few men boarded, including some who climbed into the boat as it descended. It carried more than 40 people. When it reached the sea, no conventional lifeboats remained on the deck. It was shortly after 2 in the morning. Titanic had perhaps 20 minutes left. Hundreds of people now moved aft. The stern remained higher and drier. The angle of the decks increased. The musicians were still remembered as playing near the entrance to the grand staircase or farther aft on the boat deck. The final piece has been debated ever since. Some survivors remembered a hymn, often identified as "Nearer, My God, to Thee." Others recalled a different sacred piece called Autumn, or a popular waltz. The musicians all died, so no one can confirm the answer. The uncertainty does not diminish what they did. At a time when escape was nearly impossible, they continued to perform. Their music became one of the last organized sounds aboard the ship. Captain Smith's final moments are also uncertain. Stories place him on the bridge, in the water, helping a child, or calling to passengers. Some accounts conflict. His body was never recovered or identified. The safest conclusion is that he remained aboard and died when the ship sank. Thomas Andrews was last remembered in different locations. One famous account placed him alone in the first-class smoking room, standing before a painting and staring into space without a life belt. That scene came from a steward's recollection, but the timing is uncertain, and other witnesses saw Andrews actively helping later. He may have moved through the ship until very near the end. His body was never found. The story of a defeated designer waiting silently has great dramatic power. The real Andrews may have been moving, warning, and working for as long as movement remained possible. At the stern, Father Thomas Biles, a Catholic priest traveling in second class, heard confessions and prayed with groups of passengers. Other clergy also offered comfort. People gathered in prayer. Others searched for family. Some stood alone. Some couples remained together. Isidore and Ida Strauss were seen seated or standing near one another. No one knows their precise final moment. The ship's lights illuminated the faces of people waiting without boats. The deck now sloped sharply enough that movement required effort. Forward, the sea reached the base of the bridge. Water covered the well deck. The forecastle disappeared. The forward mast leaned toward the surface. Titanic's enormous stern lifted higher. Furniture, luggage, dishes, and equipment shifted within the rooms. The sounds inside the ship changed. Wood cracked. Steel groaned. Air escaped from submerged spaces. The boilers and machinery no longer produced the steady rhythm of travel. Steam roared from relief pipes until engineers reduced the pressure. The great liner had become a structure under forces it had never been designed to endure. Crew members struggled to free collapsibles A and B from the roof of the officers' quarters. There was no longer time to lower them normally. Collapsible B was pushed down toward the boat deck, but landed upside down. Collapsible A reached the deck and was washed away before its canvas sides could be raised properly. As water swept across the forward boat deck, people were pulled into the sea. Some reached the floating collapsibles. Others were carried away. Harold Bride escaped from the wireless room and became trapped beneath overturned collapsible B for a time before reaching air. Second Officer Lightoller also entered the water. He was drawn against a ventilator by the suction of flooding. A blast of warm air released him. He surfaced near collapsible B and climbed onto its overturned hull. Dozens of men eventually balanced there through the night, standing in the cold with water washing around their feet. Jack Phillips may also have reached the collapsible, but he did not survive the night. Accounts differ on his final movements. 15 a.m., the angle of Titanic became extreme. The stern rose higher. People moved toward the aft decks. Some climbed over railings and stood on the outside as the deck became too steep. The ship's band stopped, whether because the musicians could no longer stand, because they chose to seek safety, or because the final minutes had arrived. The last rockets had been fired. The wireless had gone silent. Carpathia was still approaching through ice. Inside Titanic, the electrical system began to fail. The lights dimmed. Some witnesses saw them glow red. Then they went out. For the first time since the collision, the ship became a dark shape beneath the stars. A deep series of sounds came from within. Survivors described explosions, tearing, crashing, and a roar like thunder. For many years, official accounts often suggested that Titanic sank intact. Survivors who said they saw the ship break were sometimes doubted. The discovery of the wreck in 1985 proved that the ship had separated into two major sections. The breakup likely occurred at a relatively shallow angle compared with the near-vertical images shown in some films, though the precise sequence remains studied and debated. As the bow pulled downward and the stern rose, enormous stress concentrated in the ship's structure between them. The hull could not support its own weight across the unsupported middle. Titanic broke apart. The forward section began descending toward the seabed. The stern settled back briefly. To people in the water and boats, it may have appeared that the remaining section would float. Then it rose again. Air trapped inside escaped through openings. The stern turned and tilted. For a short time, the rear of Titanic stood high against the sky. Hundreds of people clung to decks, railings, and fittings. Then the stern slipped below the surface. The final sinking occurred at approximately 2:20 a.m. on April 15th. 2 hours and 40 minutes had passed since the collision. The largest ship in the world was gone. Where electric lights, music, engines, and voices had filled the night, only darkness remained. Then came the sound that survivors remembered most. More than 1,000 people were in the freezing sea. Some wore life belts that kept their heads above water. Many did not know how to swim. The water temperature was around 28 degrees Fahrenheit, below the usual freezing point of fresh water because of its salt content. Cold shock made breathing difficult. Muscles weakened quickly. The human body could not remain functional for long. People called toward the lifeboats. They called names. They called for help. The cries spread across the still water. Passengers in the boats listened. Some wanted to return. Others feared that desperate swimmers would overturn or swamp the boats. Most did not go back immediately. The decision saved those already inside from a possible risk. It also left hundreds in the sea. The calls gradually became fewer. Then the Atlantic grew quiet again. The word silence appears repeatedly in survivor memories. The silence after the ship vanished. The silence after the cries stopped. The silence beneath a sky crowded with stars. Around the wreck site, lifeboats drifted among ice. Some were half full. Some were crowded. Passengers shivered in evening clothes, night clothes, coats, and life belts. Children cried or slept. Women asked about husbands. Men stared toward the place where the ship had been. No one yet knew who else had survived. No one knew whether another ship would truly arrive. Quartermaster Hickens, in boat number 6, argued against returning. Margaret Brown urged that the boat should help. The conflict later contributed to her reputation as a forceful survivor. The boat did not return to the main group of swimmers. Other boats also remained away. Fifth Officer Lowe took a more active approach. He brought several boats together and redistributed passengers, freeing space in Boat 14. He waited before returning, concerned that the crowd in the water would overwhelm the boat. By the time he rowed back, most people were already dead from cold. His crew found only a few alive. One was a steward. Another was a first-class passenger. Bodies floated in life belts. Lowe's boat also found collapsible partly flooded and carrying survivors who had stood in icy water. People were transferred. 3 bodies were left behind in the collapsible. On overturned collapsible B, Lightoller and dozens of men struggled to maintain balance. The canvas boat floated upside down. Every movement threatened to roll it. They stood in lines, leaning together as waves passed. The air was bitterly cold. Some men collapsed. Lightoller called instructions. As dawn approached, other lifeboats noticed them. Survivors were transferred from the overturned hull. Boat number 12 eventually carried a large group, perhaps more than 70 people, after taking on passengers from other boats and collapsibles. It sat low in the water. The horizon began to pale. Icebergs became visible around them. Some appeared as small white shapes. Others rose high above the sea. In daylight, survivors could see the danger through which Carpathia was racing. They could also see how empty the ocean looked without Titanic. There was debris, deck chairs, wood, cushions, fragments, and people who would never move again. Far to the southeast, smoke appeared on the horizon. A ship was coming. At first, it was only a dark mark. Then funnels became visible. Carpathia had arrived. Captain Arthur Rostron had driven Carpathia through the night with extraordinary urgency. The Cunard liner was smaller and slower than Titanic. She had been traveling toward Europe when the distress call arrived. Rostron turned her around and ordered preparations that transformed the entire ship. Passengers were moved away from public rooms. Doctors prepared treatment areas. Stewards gathered blankets. Cooks made coffee, soup, and hot drinks. Ladders and slings were rigged along the sides. The crew waited without knowing how many people they would find. Carpathia passed icebergs in darkness. Rostron placed extra lookouts and maintained speed. It was a dangerous approach. Had his ship struck ice, 2 disasters might have unfolded in the same night. 30 in the morning, Carpathia saw a green flare fired from one of Titanic's lifeboats. The first boat came alongside shortly after 4. Passengers climbed rope ladders. Crew members lifted children in mail sacks, slings, and blankets. Some survivors were too cold or injured to climb. Harold Bride, whose feet had been badly hurt, was carried aboard. The rescue continued for hours. One boat after another reached Carpathia. Names were not immediately checked in an orderly way. Families searched the decks. People asked every arriving group whether a husband, wife, child, friend, or servant had been seen. Most questions received no clear answer. Margaret Brown helped other survivors, assisted with translation, and later supported efforts to raise money for those who had lost everything. Madeline Astor waited for news of her husband. Ida Strauss did not appear. Neither did Isidore. The Duff Gordons arrived. Bruce Ismay came aboard from Collapsible Sea. He was given a cabin and remained in a state of shock and exhaustion. Rostron later described him as devastated. By around 8:30 in the morning, the last survivors had been taken aboard. Carpathia counted approximately 700 people rescued, with the exact historical total often given as 705 or 706, depending on how lists are compiled. More than 1,500 had died. The lifeboats were brought aboard where possible. Some were left drifting. Rostron held a brief service over the site. Prayers were said for those lost. Then Carpathia turned west toward New York. Continuing to Europe would have taken the survivors away from their intended destination and from waiting relatives. Halifax was closer than New York, but severe ice and practical concerns influenced the decision. New York became the destination. Carpathia was now crowded far beyond its normal passenger load. Survivors wore borrowed clothes. Some had no shoes. Many had left Titanic carrying nothing except a life belt. People slept in corridors and public rooms. First dash, second dash, and third-class distinctions did not disappear completely, but the disaster had forced everyone aboard the same rescue ship. Carpathia's passengers gave up cabins, clothing, and supplies. Doctors treated exposure, injuries, and exhaustion. Wireless operators attempted to send lists of survivors. The demand for information was overwhelming. Messages crossed one another. Names were misspelled. Rumors moved faster than confirmed facts. On land, confusion had already begun. Early reports suggested Titanic had struck ice but remained afloat. Some claimed all passengers had been transferred to another vessel. White Star representatives struggled to obtain reliable information. The ship's reputation for safety made the truth difficult to accept. Newspapers published hopeful headlines. Families gathered outside offices. Then the messages became darker. Carpathia had rescued survivors. Titanic had sunk. The number saved was far below the number aboard. In New York, relatives and reporters crowded around the White Star Line offices. Lists were posted and revised. A name absent from one list might appear on another. Telegraph offices worked constantly. People waited in rain. Some refused to leave. The uncertainty lasted for days. Carpathia's wireless equipment handled official messages, survivor telegrams, and demands from newspapers. Captain Rostron tried to protect the survivors from aggressive press requests. He also wanted to preserve the limited capacity of the wireless for navigation and essential communication. When Carpathia approached New York on the evening of April 18th, rain fell over the harbor. Thousands of people gathered despite the weather. Tugs and small vessels moved nearby. Reporters attempted to approach. The Statue of Liberty stood in the darkness. Before landing survivors, Carpathia went to the White Star Pier and unloaded Titanic's lifeboats. The empty boats were among the first physical objects from the disaster to reach the city. They hung from Carpathia's side, wet and silent. Then the rescue ship moved to its own pier. One by one, survivors came ashore. Some were met by family. Some were taken to hospitals. Some entered a city where they knew no one. Third-class passengers who had planned to continue to distant destinations now lacked money, tickets, clothing, and companions. Charities, immigrant aid societies, religious groups, and private citizens offered assistance. The relief effort became international. Money was collected in Britain, the United States, and elsewhere. Families of crew members in Southampton suffered especially. Entire streets had lost men. Some households lost more than one wage earner. The tragedy was not confined to famous passengers. It reached kitchens, dockside homes, villages, and immigrant communities across the world. Within hours of Carpathia's arrival, a United States Senate investigation began. Senator William Alden Smith led the inquiry. American officials moved quickly partly because important witnesses, including J. Bruce Ismay, and surviving officers, were in the United States and might soon return to Britain. Hearings began in New York, then continued in Washington. 82 witnesses eventually testified. The questioning examined Titanic's speed, ice warnings, lifeboats, wireless procedures, crew training, the actions of officers, the role of Californian, and the treatment of passengers by class. The hearings sometimes revealed confusion between lawmakers and maritime professionals. Technical terms had to be explained. Senator Smith was mocked in parts of the British press for questions that appeared naive. Yet the investigation brought crucial testimony into public view and demanded answers that shipping companies and regulators could not easily avoid. J. Bruce Ismay testified repeatedly. He denied pressuring Captain Smith to race. He described the collision and his escape. Every detail of his conduct was examined. Because he was alive, he had to answer for an organization whose captain and chief designer could not speak. Surviving officers described the evacuation. Charles Lightoller defended Captain Smith and the practices of experienced seamen. Harold Bride explained the wireless work. Passengers described boats leaving partially filled. Crewmen from Californian gave evidence about rockets seen in the night. The American inquiry criticized the failure to reduce speed despite ice warnings, the insufficient lifeboat provision, weaknesses in emergency preparation, and Californian's failure to respond. Britain opened its own wreck commissioner's inquiry in May. Lord Mersey presided. The proceedings were larger and more technically detailed. Nearly 100 witnesses answered thousands of questions. A large model of Titanic helped investigators understand the ship. The inquiry examined construction, navigation, ice warnings, evacuation, and rescue. It concluded that the loss resulted from collision with an iceberg brought about by excessive speed. It did not find that Titanic had been improperly built according to the standards of the day. Captain Smith was not accused of negligence in the harshest legal sense because his actions followed long-standing maritime practice. But the disaster showed that the practice itself was dangerous. When ice was reported, clear weather and experienced lookouts were not enough. The inquiries also addressed the number and loading of lifeboats. More boats were necessary. Drills needed improvement. Crews had to know each boat's capacity and station. Emergency communication required clearer rules. Wireless service could no longer be treated only as a private commercial convenience. The Californian question remained especially bitter. Its officers had watched rockets. Its wireless operator was asleep. The ship did not move toward Titanic until morning. The inquiries believed Californian might have reached the scene before the sinking or soon afterward. Captain Stanley Lord, Californian's commander, spent the rest of his life defending his actions and disputing the distances involved. Later researchers have continued debating the positions, visibility, and possible presence of another vessel. No debate can change the central fact. A ship close enough to see signals did not arrive. While officials questioned survivors, another duty began at sea. The White Star Line chartered the cable ship Mackay Bennett from Halifax to recover bodies. The ship carried undertakers, clergy, embalming supplies, ice, coffins, canvas, and heavy weights for burial at sea. The crew sailed toward the wreck area, not expecting rescue. They expected recovery. Over several days, Mackay Bennett found hundreds of bodies. Each was numbered. Personal effects were collected and recorded. Descriptions were written. Some bodies were identified through clothing, papers, jewelry, initials, or physical features. Others remained unknown. Space and embalming supplies were limited. Many bodies, especially those of crew members and unidentified people, were buried at sea. Religious services were held before each burial. The decisions later caused pain and anger, particularly among families who wanted remains returned. But the recovery crew worked under difficult conditions with limited capacity. Other ships joined the search. In total, more than 300 bodies were recovered, while most of those lost were never found. Bodies brought to Halifax were taken to a temporary morgue. Families, agents, and officials attempted identification. Some victims were transported elsewhere. Others were buried in Halifax cemeteries. Rows of simple stones still mark many graves. Some carry names. Others carry only a number and the date of death. Among the recovered was John Jacob Astor. Isidore Strauss was also found. Ida Strauss was not. Wallace Hartley, the bandmaster, was recovered with his music case strapped to him according to accounts surrounding the return of his body. His funeral in England drew a large crowd. Thomas Andrews, Captain Smith, Benjamin Guggenheim, Jack Phillips, and many others were never identified among the recovered. The sea kept most of the dead. As survivor stories reached newspapers, fact and legend began blending almost immediately. Some accounts were accurate. Others were exaggerated. Reporters competed for dramatic details. Stories of cowardice and heroism were simplified. Rumors circulated that an officer had shot passengers and then himself. No reliable evidence has confirmed that story. Different witnesses named different officers, and surviving testimony conflicts. Stories claimed that third-class passengers had been deliberately imprisoned below. Real barriers, delays, and discrimination existed, but the most extreme versions did not describe every route or every crew action. Stories said Titanic had been declared absolutely unsinkable. The language used before the voyage was usually more qualified. Shipbuilder publications and promotional material described the Olympic-class vessels as designed to be practically unsinkable. After the disaster, that confidence was remembered as a boast against nature. The myth grew because it expressed something people felt to be true even when the exact words were uncertain. Titanic represented faith in technology. Then technology failed. But the ship did not sink because technology alone failed. People designed the regulations. People decided how many boats were sufficient. People continued at speed. People organized the evacuation. People sent warnings. People misunderstood signals. People also kept the lights on, transmitted distress calls, rode through darkness, gave up places, and raced a rescue ship through ice. Titanic was a human system. Its failures and courage were both human. In the months after the disaster, survivors tried to rebuild their lives. Some rarely spoke about the night. Others gave interviews or lectures. Lawrence Beasley published an early account. Archibald Gracie, who had survived on Collapsible B, studied the events and wrote in detail, but his health never fully recovered, and he died later that year. Harold Bride continued working at sea for a time. Charles Lightoller served during the First World War and later took part in the evacuation from Dunkirk with his private boat. Margaret Brown became active in relief, labor rights, and public causes. Bruce Ismay withdrew from public life. The label of coward followed him despite his charitable work and the complexity of the evidence. Families continued grieving without graves. Children grew up with only stories of parents. Widows managed households once supported by shipboard wages. The voyage had lasted less than 5 days. Its consequences would last for generations. The laws of the sea began changing almost immediately. Ships were required to carry lifeboat space for everyone aboard rather than relying on formulas that had become outdated as vessels grew larger. Lifeboat drills received greater attention. Crews had to know how boats would be filled, lowered, and commanded. The practice of sending a ship through known ice at high speed came under new scrutiny. Wireless communication became central to maritime safety. Passenger ships increasingly maintained a continuous radio watch so that distress calls could not go unheard simply because one operator had gone to sleep. Emergency messages were given clearer priority. Backup power and standardized procedures became more important. In 1913, the International Ice Patrol was established to monitor iceberg danger in the North Atlantic shipping lanes. Ships and later aircraft observed ice conditions and reported the limits of dangerous areas. The patrol's work would become a quiet legacy of Titanic. Most travelers crossing the Atlantic in later decades never saw the patrol ships. They did not need to know the names of the observers plotting iceberg positions. Safety often works invisibly. Its success is measured by disasters that do not happen. In 1914, maritime nations adopted the first International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea, commonly known as SOLAS. The First World War prevented that original convention from operating exactly as intended, but its principles shaped later agreements. New versions followed. The modern SOLAS system became one of the foundations of international ship safety. Enough life-saving equipment, reliable communication, fire protection, emergency planning, standards shared across borders. Titanic had been a British ship carrying people of many nations toward an American port. Its loss demonstrated that safety at sea could not belong to one company or one country alone. The ocean connected nations. The rules had to do the same. White Star's remaining Olympic-class ships were altered. Olympic returned to Belfast for major modifications. Her watertight bulkheads were extended higher. An additional inner skin was added along vulnerable parts of the hull. More lifeboats were installed. She later served during the First World War, transporting troops and earning a long career that Titanic never had. Olympic remained in service until the 1930s. The third sister, Britannic, was still under construction when Titanic sank. Her design was changed to improve safety. She was intended for passenger service, but entered the First World War as a hospital ship. In November 1916, Britannic struck a mine in the Aegean Sea and sank. Most people aboard survived because there were more boats, the water was warmer, land was relatively near, and evacuation conditions were different. Yet the loss of Britannic meant that 2 of the 3 Olympic-class sisters ended on the seabed. Only Olympic completed the long civilian life their designers had imagined. For decades after 1912, Titanic lay unseen. The ship had sunk in water more than 12,000 feet deep. The bow and stern descended separately. The bow, streamlined and heavy, traveled downward with relative stability. It struck the seabed with enormous force and buried itself partly in the sediment. The stern fell in a more violent manner. Air trapped within escaped or compressed. Decks collapsed. The structure twisted. When it reached the bottom, it was badly damaged. Between the 2 main sections, objects spread across a large debris field. Boilers, pieces of machinery, dishes, shoes, coal, sections of hull, personal belongings, parts of rooms that had once been warm and bright. The wreck rested in darkness under immense pressure. No sunlight reached it. The water was near freezing. For many years, people argued about where Titanic had landed and whether it could ever be found. The distress position transmitted during the sinking was inaccurate. Navigation in 1912 relied on observations, dead reckoning, and calculations far less precise than modern satellite systems. Searchers had to examine a broad area. Several expeditions tried and failed. The depth made exploration expensive and technically difficult. Then, in 1985, a joint American-French team led by Robert Ballard of the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution and Jean-Louis Michel of the French Oceanographic Institute, IFREMER, searched the North Atlantic. The expedition used advanced sonar and a deep-towed camera system called Argo. The mission also had a secret earlier purpose connected to the investigation of 2 lost United States Navy submarines. After that work, the team used its remaining time to search for Titanic. Ballard believed the ship's breakup would have scattered debris across the seabed. Instead of looking only for one large hull, the team searched for a trail of objects. In the early hours of September 1, 1985, the cameras saw something manufactured lying on the ocean floor. Then more debris appeared. A boiler came into view. Its shape matched photographs of Titanic's machinery. After 73 years, The ship had been found. The researchers watched the images in silence and excitement. Then they remembered the hour. The discovery had occurred close to the anniversary time of Titanic's sinking on the clock. The celebration became more subdued. They were not merely looking at a machine. They had entered a grave site. The expedition followed the debris toward the bow. There it stood in darkness. The railings were still recognizable. The anchor remained in place. The forward deck preserved the shape seen in photographs from Southampton and Queenstown. But the ship was broken. The stern lay hundreds of meters away, devastated. The discovery resolved one of the great questions from survivor testimony. Titanic had not reached the bottom intact. The people who remembered the hull breaking had been right. In 1986, Ballard returned with the deep-diving submersible Alvin and the small remotely operated vehicle Jason Jr. For the first time, explorers approached the wreck closely and looked into openings. Cameras moved past windows and railings. The grand staircase itself was gone, leaving a large opening beneath the glass dome area. Wood had been eaten away or destroyed. Metal frames, chandeliers, and fittings remained. A boiler stood in the debris. Dishes lay in lines where wooden cabinets had vanished around them. Shoes rested in pairs. Those shoes became some of the most powerful objects at the site. Leather survived conditions that consumed human remains. A pair of shoes could mark where a person had come to rest, even though no body was visible. The wreck was not an empty stage. It was the final location of more than 1,500 lives. Later expeditions photographed, mapped, filmed, and sometimes recovered artifacts. Thousands of objects were raised from the debris field. A bell, jewelry, tools, dishes, clothing, fragments of the ship, personal papers protected inside leather cases. Supporters of recovery argued that artifacts would otherwise be destroyed by corrosion and could educate the public when conserved and displayed. Critics argued that Titanic should be left undisturbed as a maritime grave. The debate continues because both preservation and respect carry moral weight. An object raised from the seabed can bring a forgotten person closer to the present. Removing it also changes a place where the dead remain. The wreck itself is slowly disappearing. Iron-eating microorganisms help create rust-colored formations called rusticlase. Currents, bacteria, corrosion, and structural collapse weaken the hull. Decks have fallen. Railings have changed. The captain's bathtub, once visible through an opening, can no longer be seen in the same way after surrounding structures collapsed. The famous bow still resembles the ship, but time continues its work. Titanic was built of steel to cross an ocean. Now the ocean is gradually returning that steel to its elements. The wreck may never vanish completely. Heavy components, engines, and scattered materials will remain. But the recognizable ship is fading. This slow decay adds another layer to the story. Titanic appeared permanent when she left Belfast. She seemed stronger than nature. Yet every machine, no matter how large, exists only for a time. The sea does not need to conquer quickly. It has patience. Titanic also survives far beyond the wreck. It lives in books, museums, songs, paintings, family stories, documentaries, and films. Each generation creates its own Titanic. Some focus on technology, some on class, some on romance, some on heroism, some on failures of leadership, some on the mystery of the last minutes. The real event contains all these themes, but belongs fully to none of them. Titanic was not only a symbol. It was a place occupied by individuals. The ship carried babies who could not understand the journey. Teenagers imagining America. Mothers protecting children. Fathers hoping to find work. Servants carrying the belongings of wealthy employers. Engineers watching gauges. Stewards making beds. Cooks preparing meals. Sailors coiling rope. Musicians reading notes. Postal clerks sorting letters. Businessmen planning appointments. Couples returning from honeymoons. People escaping old lives. People returning to familiar ones. Their plans ended or changed in a single night. That human scale is easy to lose because Titanic itself was so large. The number of dead becomes a statistic. The ship becomes a silhouette. But every empty place in a lifeboat represented a possible life. Every name on a memorial represented a network of other people. A family waited at a station. A mother opened a telegram. A child grew older without a parent. A letter in the mail room never reached its destination. History remembers the famous last gestures. The Strasses remaining together. the musicians playing, the engineers keeping the lights alive, the wireless operators calling across the sea, the captain of Carpathia racing through ice. These stories matter. Yet courage was not limited to famous names. It lived in actions too small for official testimony. A third-class passenger guiding a stranger through a corridor, a steward returning below decks, a sailor steadying a lifeboat, a woman comforting another woman's child, a passenger giving away a coat, a fireman climbing from the flooding boiler room and warning those above. Most of these moments vanished with the people who witnessed them. We know only that they must have existed because human beings, even in fear, often reach for one another. The disaster also warns against the comfort of hindsight. From the present, every mistake appears obvious. Slow the ship. Provide more boats. Keep the wireless operator awake. Respond to the rockets. Open every route. Fill every seat. But the people of 1912 did not stand outside the story. They lived inside assumptions built over years. They trusted regulations. They trusted experience. They trusted the ship. Real safety requires more than avoiding yesterday's mistake. It requires imagining failures that have never happened before. It requires questioning normal practices before tragedy proves them abnormal. Titanic changed maritime safety because the world could no longer pretend that size guaranteed survival. The disaster did not end confidence in technology. Ships became larger. Aircraft crossed oceans. Cities rose higher. Human beings continued building. But Titanic added a quieter truth to the modern age. Progress without preparation can become vulnerability. Luxury above does not erase labor below. A legal minimum may not be a safe maximum. And nature does not negotiate with reputation. More than a century after the sinking, ships still crossed the North Atlantic. They passed through regions once traveled by Titanic. Their crews received satellite forecasts, iceberg reports, and precise positions. Radio watches continue through the night. Life-saving equipment waits for every person aboard. Many of these protections seem ordinary now. That ordinariness was purchased by earlier loss. Somewhere below those modern routes, Titanic remains. The bow points into darkness. The anchors rest against the hull. The promenade windows look out onto water no passenger was meant to see. No music fills the rooms. No footsteps cross the decks. Fine china lies beneath sediment. Coal from Belfast is scattered among objects that once belonged to people traveling toward New York. Above, the ocean changes with every season. Storms pass. Icebergs drift south. Ships cross the horizon. Sunlight moves over waves more than 2 miles above the wreck. The distance between the surface and Titanic is so great that the two seem like different worlds. Yet they remain connected by memory. On the night of April 14, 1912, the sea was calm enough to hide danger. The stars were bright enough to make the darkness beautiful. A ship carried more than 2,000 people westward with nearly every light glowing. 40, steel met ice. 20, the stern disappeared. By dawn, the age that had created Titanic was still alive, but its confidence had changed. The ship had been built as proof that human beings could master distance, machinery, and the sea. Its loss proved something more enduring. Human achievement can be magnificent without being invincible. Titanic's story is not powerful because a great ship sank. Ships had sunk before, and many would sink afterward. It is powerful because the ship contained an entire world. Rich and poor, old and young, hope and routine, pride and labor, courage and hesitation, all moving together through the darkness, unaware that history was only hours away. The ocean did not choose among them, but the world they had built shaped who reached the boats, who received instructions, who found a clear path, and who waited too long. That is why Titanic remains more than a maritime accident. It is a story about the promises people make through technology. A story about the limits hidden inside those promises. A story about how quickly ordinary life can become memory. And a story about what human beings do when the future they expected suddenly disappears. Tonight, the North Atlantic continues moving above the wreck. Currents pass through broken corridors. Rusticles grow along the railings. The bow settles a little deeper into the seabed. The ship is quiet now, but the names remain. The lessons remain. And in the darkness beneath the ocean, Titanic continues its final voyage through history, carrying no passengers, making no sound, moving nowhere, and still reminding the world that even the greatest creations are remembered not for their size, but for the lives held within them.